Yeah, so hi, my name is Erica Telly, coming at you live from Seattle, Washington. So today I'm going to talk to you about the compliance features that are available in Microsoft Teams. So I know there's a lot of people who either started using Teams very recently or maybe got it deployed and now are coming back to think about compliance. Or maybe you need to deploy it, but need to also ensure compliance before that's done. Well, this presentation's for you. So in this talk, thank you to our sponsors. They're the ones making this free learning opportunity happen. So this presentation is going to be an overview of what's available. Because the number one question that I hear people ask is they don't know what's even available. So by giving an introduction to each one of these topics, you can understand, number one, why you would use it, and number two, is it something that you need to worry about or that you might want to use? And then, if it is something that you want to deploy, I've linked to the Microsoft documentation for the how-to instructions. And each one of these could be its own hour presentation. So after each one of these sections, I'm going to pause to look at the Q&A and see what questions you've asked. So please go ahead and enter questions into the chat and we'll address those throughout the presentation. So before we even get started, I want to talk a little bit about the compliance licensing. So this is a great licensing chart from a GitHub project created by Aaron Dinage, who's a Microsoft employee based in Australia. And, I think these charts are the most useful for understanding the complex topic of licensing. And then additionally, on Monday, Microsoft released new compliance licensing documentation with some changes that were introduced August 1st. So I have those two links there on the slide. So specifically here are the features we're interested in for the purposes of this presentation. So first, of course, Microsoft Teams, which is included with your E3 license. And then also with E3, which by the way, is the license that most organizations have. And then if you're on the government plans, it's the same features that are available. It's just called G3 for government and G5 instead of E for enterprise. So the other features that you get in E3 are e-discovery, the ability to search for content, put content on hold, and export Office 365 content. You're also able to apply retention policies and view the audit log and set alerts. Now, in the E5 compliance license, you're able to do some more things. So, for example, advanced e-discovery, which uses artificial intelligence and other advanced capabilities to really reduce the amount of time you need for discovering and culling through mountains of documents. We have advanced data governance, which is more the records management and advanced retention features. We have information barriers, which we'll go over in the next section. Supervision policies, which have been recently renamed to communication compliance, records management, and then the audit log is available for 1 year instead of 90 days. Now, throughout the presentation, I'll remind you whether this is an E3 or an E5 feature, so you can tell whether or not you have access to it. So the first thing to understand is that Microsoft Teams is built from the ground up with security and compliance in mind. And to that goal, Teams does support more than 90 regulations and standards, including common ones like HIPAA for healthcare, the FERPA for education institutions, FedRAMP for federal government, and of course our favorite GDPR, which now applies to everybody. So you can look up the specifics of how Microsoft supports these regulations, and I'll show you that in just a second. And then if you need to prepare for an audit, like present documentation to your auditor showing how Office 365 meets the regulation standards, you can find those reports in the Service Trust portal. So here is a screenshot of the 90 standards and laws that Microsoft follows for Microsoft Teams and all of its services. So you can see it's divided by global, US government, industry, and regional. For each one of these, there's a documentation article sitting behind it. So for example, HIPAA is a very popular one right now with medical professionals wanting to switch to telehealthcare over something like Teams, so they can still do appointments without being in person. So if I click on that, it'll bring me to an article where it outlines how Microsoft interprets the standard, how they meet it and work together, frequently asked questions, and other resources. So please, if you need to meet specific regulations, check out this documentation. And then if we go to the Service Trust portal, which is just servicetrust.microsoft.com, or linked to in the slide previously, you can see you're able to pivot on different types of audit reports, and then you'll be able to download them and give those to your auditor. And then also in here are data protection resources, like, for example, GDPR control mappings. So one of the requirements of GDPR is that you need to be able to show an auditor how you have implemented controls to protect people's information. So Microsoft has done a bit of that work for you in an Excel sheet, so you can see that. Another great feature for getting started with compliance is using the compliance score. So this is available in the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center, which is an administration portal that's available in Office 365. And here you're able to add assessments, like, for example, if GDPR is important to your organization, you would add an assessment that shows how you are meeting those obligations and requirements of GDPR. It would give you a checklist of improvement actions and steps that you can take to be more compliant, and you can see how you're doing with the score itself. So this is another thing to explore if you have to meet specific compliance obligations. So for the rest of the presentation, we're going to be discussing specific features. So first, I'm just going to quickly check to see if there's any questions yet in the chat. So Wesley asks, does your whole org need an E5 license to set up E5 compliance, or is one E5 license enough? So the answer is pretty much you need to have every user licensed. A little bit depends on what features you're using. For example, if you're using information barriers, which we'll talk about next, then every user that's included in information barrier policy would need to be licensed. Or if you're using retention on a SharePoint site, every member of that site would need to have a license. If you start trying to do partial licensing, it gets too complex too fast, to be honest. And then Bart asks, hi, Erica. I was wondering if it's possible to launch 2 or even more standalone Teams apps in order to be able to launch different Word documents and copy paste from each. So the best way to do that is by using either Chrome or Edge Chrome and setting up different profiles. And that way you're able to open different Teams instances at the same time, even logged into the same account. You could do the same thing with the private browser window as well. That's the easiest workaround for now. And then Teams is adding some pop-out capabilities, such as right now they have it for chat pop-out, or they will have it soon for everybody, but not for documents yet. Of course, if you also have the option to open those documents in the Word client application on your desktop as well. All right, so switching back to the presentation, information barriers. So what are information barriers? So basically, the reason we might use them are, for example, to avoid conflicts of interest, Or in an education scenario, you would not want high schoolers to be talking to middle schoolers over Teams one-on-one chat. And so you would create two different groups, one for high schoolers and one for middle schoolers, and then create a barrier so they're not allowed to contact each other. This is also something that's often required in financial services institutions. It can also be used to safeguard internal information, like if some people are working on a highly confidential project, like a super secret merger and acquisition, you might prevent them from talking to some people in their organization. So how does this work? So it's basically putting up an ethical wall configured by an administrator that either allows or prevents individuals or groups from communicating with each other. For example, you might say that the research team can always communicate with the product team, but the research team is not allowed to talk to, say, the marketing team. You could say the day traders are never allowed to talk to the marketing team, but the day traders are allowed to talk to they wouldn't want to talk to the hedge fund managers either. But basically, you're trying to prevent insider trading. So we'll show you in a second how you can configure these policies. But first, a little more information. So information barriers are currently available for Teams, chats and conversations, and meetings, and other types of actions in Teams. And it's in preview for being able to prevent for SharePoint files, and it's going to be coming soon for email. So kind of keep that in mind when you're planning these. This list is when what actions are prevented using information barriers. So for example, starting a chat, attending a meeting, placing a call. And then this is when it's actually checking if there is an information barrier. So when a new member is added to a team, when someone starts a screen sharing session, etc. So a common question is, can a person be part of more than one information barrier group? The answer is no. You need to have one person only in one information barrier group. So just keep that in mind when planning. This is what it looks like if somebody is prevented from communicating with another person. They won't even show up in a search in Teams to start a chat. And if they try to start a meeting or attend a meeting that has users that are prevented from communicating with each other, it'll just tell you that your company policy is preventing you from joining the call. So what happens when a user maybe is in one department and then they change jobs and the new department is behind a barrier? So in that case, it'll actually remove the user from any ongoing chats with prohibited people. So that's pretty cool. And then finally, if I can't believe I miscapitalized SharePoint. It's supposed to be capital P. Oh, I've never done that, so embarrassing. Anyway, if you have a file stored in a SharePoint site, then it'll say access denied and tell you it's due to an organizational policy so that users know it's not due to a permissions error. So right now, the only way to set up information barriers is by using PowerShell. However, they did show some mock-ups at Ignite where you were able to configure these barriers through the user interface in the Compliance Center. They just haven't launched it yet. The documentation is actually pretty helpful. I am a PowerShell novice and definitely need scripts that I can just copy and paste rather than write from scratch. So they have this wonderful Excel file that helps you to write the PowerShell commands to create this and manage the segments. So you just enter the criteria into the light gray box and it generates the PowerShell script on the right-hand side that you would then use to create the segments. So go ahead and check that out. All right, so before we dive into records management and retention, I'm just going to go ahead and check if there's any questions. All right, no new questions. Please just type those in as you think of them. All right, records management and retention. So the most important thing for managing retention in Microsoft Teams is to understand where the data actually lives. Where does it actually sit and where is it stored? So what I've done here is list out all of the different functionality that's available in Teams, and then use the color to say where it actually lives. So for example, if you're doing if you're chatting in the conversation area for Microsoft Teams, then those conversations and the record of those conversations is stored in the Exchange group mailbox that was created when you created the team. It's something that's created automatically behind the scenes, and you may not even know it's there, but that's where the data actually is sitting. If people are in one-to-one chats or using the chat functionality to speak with many people, then those conversations, both what people said and the replies, are stored in each user's mailbox. Any files that are shared in the chat are going to go into a folder in their OneDrive that's automatically created. And then, of course, inside a team, files are always stored in a SharePoint site that's behind the scenes for each team. And then depending on the meeting and the call information, it's going to sit in both the Exchange group mailbox or the Exchange users mailbox, just depending if you create that meeting from within a channel versus you're in Outlook and you just add Teams information to the meeting invite. So remember these locations, because we're actually going to be applying retention on SharePoint sites, OneDrive sites, and Exchange, not to quote Teams. So for example, this is just a handy table that it goes through each feature that was on the previous slide and then tells you what tool you would need to manage it for compliance, either retention or e-discovery. So we already went over chats, conversations, and files. Other things such as, let's say, Power BI. Well, it's just showing you the information in a Power BI dashboard. Like, that information doesn't actually live in Teams. So you would manage the security and compliance in the Power BI portal rather than in Teams. Some notable exceptions, if you're using Yammer, sometimes people add that to a team. That doesn't have retention yet, but the e-discovery functionality is in preview, which you'll see in some screenshots shortly. Also, e-discovery is coming soon to Microsoft Stream, specifically the transcripts, but there isn't retention available yet. So again, I'll share the slides after the presentation, but this is just a handy cheat sheet for when you actually are starting to plan out your policies and you want to remember where everything is actually located. So for managing retention specifically, there's two things that you could use. Number one are retention policies, and number two are retention labels. Now, I definitely wish Microsoft had come up with a little bit better naming convention than policies and labels, just because it's not very intuitive that they are different things and when to use what. So this is just a little table showing you what functionality is available with retention labels versus retention policies. Now, you have access to both of these if you have an E3 license, so no worries about that. So specifically for Teams, note here that if you want to manage Teams, specifically chats and conversations, you need to use a retention policy. So the difference kind of between policies and labels, so policies tend to manage containers of information. For example, a whole SharePoint site or everything in a user's mailbox. Whereas labels tend to manage individual items such as individual documents or emails. Now you can use labels on a container. It's just kind of a general, it's just generally how they're used. So let's look at each one of these a little bit more in detail. So first, looking at retention policies, which are the ones that you need in order to manage Teams chats and conversations. So on the left-hand side, we can see the settings that are available. So what I see people doing the most with Teams chats and conversations is to either keep them for a certain amount of time, like say 3 years, because they're required to keep a record of all employee communications for a certain amount of time. The other thing I see is enforcing the deletion of chats and conversations. So for example, some organizations will say, we want all Teams chats and conversations deleted after 30 days. So nothing stays around longer than 30 days. So even though it's called a retention policy, you can actually use it for deletion too. So, you can set that in days, months, or years. It's pretty simple there. So once you create a retention policy settings, next it's going to ask you to choose the locations where you want to use the retention policy. So these are all of the locations that are available in a retention policy. You can either apply it to everywhere, which is defined by Exchange email, public folders, SharePoint, OneDrive, and Office 365 groups. Or if you're specifically using a policy to manage channels and chats, then you can only deploy it to those locations. For some reason, you just need to create a separate policy to manage channels and chats. You can't just include it as a big group policy across Office 365. So then another situation is you might have some teams where you want to delete the messages right away, or basically after 30 days. And then you might have other teams that maybe are very important or have stricter regulations due to the nature of the business, and you want that to have a different policy. So in that case, you would use this include or exclude option. So let's say that you had 50 finance teams and they need to have a different retention policy. You would include those 50 finance sites in this policy when you deploy it. Now, if you actually want to start using the include or exclude, to be honest, you're going to need to use PowerShell. Otherwise, it's not maintainable through the UI. A friend of mine and I have been working on some guidance for that we hope can be published here pretty quick. But right now, you kind of have to figure it out yourself.
Hey, Arka, do you want to take a question before you jump?
Oh, I was going to check the questions at the end of each section.
Okay, go ahead. Go for it.
All right. So then the next option is the retention label options. So you'll want to use retention labels if you're trying to manage files for actual records where you want them to be immutable. You can see that there's more options here for what to do with the content. For files, you might trigger a disposition review, but honestly, you're probably not going to have a disposition review on chats and conversations. So there's just more options that are available with labels. And then it has a fewer number of locations when you're using labels, namely SharePoint and OneDrive and groups and emails. So for example, if you're managing files in a team, you might use a retention label on a SharePoint site to manage those files. All right, so now it's time for questions. We'll jump over to the chat. Anonymous asks, can you talk more about how to proactively manage specific words and phrases to avoid inappropriate comments? And is that a label or a policy? Actually, that is a whole different feature we're going to talk about in just a second called communication compliance. So communication compliance is what you would use to make sure that people are behaving inappropriately in chats and conversations. And hey, look, I guess it's time to talk about that. So yeah, so there's really 3 reasons that people use communication compliance. It's specifically to manage or monitor communications. So number 1, complying with corporate policies, such as not using bad language or harassing people or bullying them and just being negative in chats. Number 2, for risk management. So managing legal and corporate risks. This is a pretty broad bucket, but you can kind of massage the tool's settings to really meet any situation here. And then finally, people will use it for regulatory compliance. For example, FINRA, I think it is, requires communications oversight for to monitor for insider trading, where you need to take a random sample of emails and chats, review them to make sure there's not any insider trading. So communication compliance is an E5 feature, so it's available in the advanced compliance feature set, not in E3, unfortunately. And it kind of helps you out in 3 ways. So number 1, they've built playbooks for those 3 scenarios that we just discussed. Number 2, once you have some messages that potentially are violations of your policies, it'll have a review process you can use to look at those, as well as workflows that you can kick off to either remind the user that you're not allowed to harass people, or maybe escalate it to HR for more formal action. And then, of course, there's reporting available for compliance purposes about if policies have changed or been modified, and then also all of the individual communications that have been monitored, whether they're found to be compliant or non-compliant, etc. So these are all of the different things that you can use communication compliance to monitor. So it can be used for exchange emails, Teams chats and conversations. If you're still on Skype, you could use it to monitor Skype chats. And then you can also do some third-party data sources. The most popular I see people using is called Bloomberg Chat. It's a financial services tool that's very popular. So you could connect that up and use this to monitor those chats. So really quick, this is what the communication compliance tool looks like. So we're again in the compliance center, and this is a dashboard kind of showing you what's going on across all of your policies. Then if we click into a specific policy, you can see that there's been a lot of policy matches, and that's probably pretty concerning. And then you can also see what users had the most policy matches. If you go into the pending items, this is where you actually would conduct the review of the potential violations of the policy. So you're able to see the actual communication itself, including the thread. So it'll give you the whole thread of the conversation instead of just the individual messages, which helps you see the violation in context of the chat. You're also able to see a history of the user's potential violations with this tool. So in this case, we can see Lee Grew has been behaving very badly, and he has received one notification and 2 previous escalations because he was behaving inappropriately and using foul language. So it can also do the near duplicate detection that I mentioned to show, for example, when you send an email to 3 recipients, you have 4 copies of that email, right? The one that sent it and the 3 people it was sent to. So this just helps thread things together so that you have a smaller volume of things to review. So in this case, we're going to send Lee a notice that he has a code of conduct violation, and you're able to have these communications pre-written, so and pre-approved by legal, I assume, so that you can just use that template over and over again. And then if you need to escalate this, you can do that as well, just directly from the review pane. So then a couple other things you can do. In addition to monitoring for bad behavior, you can also monitor chats for sensitive information. Sensitive information is things like bank account numbers. There's 100 templates of different types of sensitive information that are available to you, or you could write your own. So if you just want to kind of monitor for that information and not completely block people from sending the messages, then you can use communication compliance for that. As you go through and review each item, you can tag it as questionable, non-compliant, or compliant. And then, of course, you can see that history of actions per item as well. So you can have it. Sorry, this is kept for 7 years, so you can go back later and see the history of each type of communication. So you're able to export reports of the review activity. So for each message, how it was marked, when it was resolved, what happened with it. And then you can also export and keep track of any policy updates. So you have a record of how the policies might have changed over time. So remember how I said that there's pre-built playbooks that you can use? So if you want to actually create a policy, you would click Create Policy button, and you can see there's a playbook already to monitor for offensive language. You can monitor for sensitive information, or monitor for regulatory compliance reasons. If you click on the playbook for offensive or language, you'll see that it's already configured a lot of the settings for you, such as what communications to monitor and the review conditions. And then you'll need to figure out what users or groups to supervise and who the review notifications should be sent to. You don't have to use one of these playbooks. You can always write your own policy from scratch. And the machine learning that they have that detects what is offensive or threatening language or some of these other things can be used in your custom policies as well. So with that, I'm going to switch over to the questions. So oh, someone said badly. I know. I have to say that demo is super fun to make. You're basically sending inappropriate messages to yourself, so you'll generate some alerts. I always really enjoy getting creative with that because you have to walk a fine line. You can't say anything too bad that you didn't be embarrassed to show in a demo, but it has to be bad enough it'll be caught by the artificial intelligence. So then our next set of features is around e-discovery, legal holds, audit, and content search. So we kind of call this group our discover and respond features. So first of all, this is about discovering and processing information across a wide variety of scenarios. E-discovery for litigation purposes is just one use case. You would also use this feature set to say respond to GDPR data subject requests or to perform an internal investigation on Lee to see if he has been doing anything inappropriate anywhere outside of the monitored communication channels, like maybe in a Word document or a SharePoint site. So you can use it for internal investigations as well. Or you can just, use it to search content for any purpose. So even though I'm going to call it e-discovery throughout this section, you can use the quote e-discovery tool set to accomplish any of those scenarios and more. So whether you have an E3 or an E5, you can do a few basic things when it comes to an e-discovery case. Number one, you can put people on hold, meaning that their information cannot be deleted while it's on a hold, or modified actually. Number two, you can search for content. And number three, you can export content from that search. If you have the E5 license, you have access to the advanced e-discovery tools. These allow you to basically do more with this to reduce the amount of time and cost you're spending on these investigations. So first of all, you can send notifications to your custodians that they are on hold. This is a law or a requirement in some jurisdictions. Number two, it's actually going to re-index your content to get much more rich information that you can use to filter and search within your original data set. Number two, or the next thing is it can collect things into document review sets that allow you to independently search within a result set, analyze it, tag it, redact it, really take a lot of actions on that content. And then it has machine learning capabilities that will do the email threading that we talked about in communication compliance. So basically putting, like all email threads, all messages and documents from that thread together into a family. It also does that for the team's chats and conversations as well. And then the export functionality is also a bit more advanced and better able to deal with large amounts of information. So if you are an e-discovery person and you're freaking out that your organization just deployed Teams, just so you know, these are the capabilities related to especially legal investigations that are available. If you are an e-discovery person, you basically know what these are. So moving away from actually the investigation functionality and case management, you also have the Office 365 audit log available. So the audit log is keeping track of a lot of events that are happening inside Office 365. So for example, if you wanted to monitor the permissions of a team, you could look at the audit log to see when people have been changing the permissions. Or for e-discovery, you can see who's performing searches and on what content to make sure that they're not abusing their position of power. You can also use this to monitor tenant administrations or people with kind of the super access. It's just so many options available. Here is a list of, this isn't even a list of all of the possible events. I would expand each one of these groups, and there could be anywhere from 5 to 50 more activities within each one of these groups. So the Teams related ones that I find interesting are, say, the Microsoft Teams activities. They also have activities specifically for healthcare and specifically for the shift worker application and functionality. And then, of course, you can use the Microsoft Stream activities to see who's recording what meetings. And there's just so many possibilities. There's also the ability to set alerts on some of these actions so that you can be notified when and if something occurs. So the last kind of thing that's available to you is the content search. So content search is what's driving the e-discovery functionality, but you could also just kind of perform a search to look for stuff without dealing with a whole e-discovery case. So this is the user interface where you would do that, also in the Compliance Center, big surprise. And you can either use keywords to search. You can get pretty fancy and use what's called keyword query language, or KQL, to write very advanced search searches. And then you can also set specific locations, save the searches, and export content here. So a lot of people don't know this is available, which is why I just want you to be aware that it exists. And this is also available with an E3 or an E5. So in addition to the regular audit, Microsoft just introduced the concept of advanced audit. So advanced audit allows you to extend your audit log from 3 months, which is available in E3 at 3 months. If you have E5, you can use advanced audit to extend the audit trail to a year. But you need to tell the tool what high value events you want to follow and keep for a year. You can't just keep the entire audit log for a year. That would be a lot of information. You also would get stuff showing up in the audit log faster. All right, so before we move on to the last section, I'm just going to check if there's any questions. So Anonymous asks, is there an easy way to have a user request in Teams team group creation with admin validation? So that is a Teams provisioning question, which unfortunately is a big topic, and it's not something we're going to cover in this presentation, but I bet you that Russ has a session somewhere that covers that. But what you want to search for or Google is Teams provisioning. Yes, there are ways to do this, but they all come with pros and cons. So you want to look at those and decide what's best for you. Okay, so I did want to just briefly touch on security. So I know Riaz covered it in the session previous to this, but because security and compliance go hand in hand, meaning you can't be in compliance with, like, for example, HIPAA, unless you're controlling who has access to data and how they can access it, which is technically security. So very important for each other. So actually on Monday, Microsoft published a new blog article that went through all of the security functionality at a high level with links to get more information. Frankly, I was like, thank you, Microsoft, for doing my work for this presentation for me. So I did borrow from that, and down here in the source, you can read that article. But there's a couple different ways that they're thinking about privacy and security and controls in Microsoft Teams. So first of all, if you're talking about the video conferences themselves, so running a meeting, you have options for how people can run the meeting. So for example, who can access it? Are external users allowed to access Teams meetings? Do they need to wait in a lobby before they're admitted? Can they share the screen? You can also set meeting roles. So everyone in your organization can automatically be allowed to be a presenter, for example, whereas external users are only attendees. You also will get consent for recording automatically. So as soon as you hit that record button, there's a ribbon along the top letting people know they are being recorded. So that helps you be in compliance with those laws. We're also can use channel moderation and controls. So the channel owners can set like who's allowed to post, who's allowed to change settings, etc. And then we already kind of touched on communication compliance, of course, but that's how you monitor the communications for violations or inappropriate behavior. There we go. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, Microsoft has built Teams from the ground up to be private. So unlike some competitors, Microsoft would never use the data from your meetings, from your Teams chats and conversations to serve up personalized ads. Microsoft also will never track if participants are multitasking during a meeting. Like, for example, if you use GoToWebinar, it gives the presenter a report of what percentage of people are actually looking at the screen at any one time. Teams doesn't do that because they want to maintain the privacy of people. So some other important ones are, it fully complies with GDPR and your ability to access your own data. And then it's really gone to great extents to protect your data from governments, from the US government, from Russia. I mean, from, like, let's say you're a company that's in the US, and they want access to your data for a case or law, for a legal reason, unless they serve that search warrant to you, they can't kind of, except for in extreme cases, go to Microsoft and say, hey, give me access to all this person's data. There's a really great book by Microsoft's chief legal officer, Brad Smith, called Tools and Weapons. And it goes into detail and stories about the things Microsoft has done to basically protect customer data from the government, from different governments. If you're interested in this topic, it's a well-written book and very interesting. So Microsoft is also protecting your identity and your account information. I highly recommend you turn on multi-factor authentication for everyone in your organization. Of course, Teams respects that and will require MFA for logging into Teams. You can also set conditional access policies, which basically say if a user is logged in from Seattle and then 5 minutes later they try to log in from China, it'll say that's suspicious and block the login until you can figure out what's going on. You can also use Microsoft Endpoint Manager to allow only certain devices, for example, only company-issued laptops that are joined to your domain to access Teams. You also have the ability to invite guests. That you can set whether or not you want guests to be allowed in Teams at either the organization level or per team. And then finally, external access as well. So you can turn on what's called federated chat. So like, for example, I frequently work with customers that have their own Office 365 environments. And even though they don't have an account with my organization, I can still start a chat with them because it's federated. Finally, so this has been a big one in the news lately with Zoom. So for example, Zoom does not have what they call end-to-end encryption, meaning, but Teams does. So your data is encrypted both in transit, meaning when it's being sent between computers, but also at rest, meaning when it's stored in SharePoint, stored in Exchange, or wherever it is. Data loss prevention can also be used in Microsoft Teams. So let's say that you're concerned about people sharing sensitive information in chats and conversations. If you use data loss prevention, it would actually block you from sending a message with sensitive information in it. You can use communication compliance when you don't want to block the message, but you want to be aware and monitor that it happened. So that's kind of the difference between those two. Sensitivity labels allow you to mark a team as, say, confidential or general, and then based on how it's been labeled, you could say all sites that are marked as confidential cannot have guests in them. And that's another way to control what people are doing with their teams at an organization level. Advanced threat protection, scans your files to make sure there's not anything bad in them. And then cloud app security allows you to, basically look for anything that's suspicious or malicious. So that's kind of the overview of the security features. Again, I just wanted to touch on them at a high level, just in case you're not aware of everything that exists. And now you know what to Google if you want to search for more information. So with that, I'm going to check and see if there's any more questions.
Great job, Erica. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so is conditional access included in an E3 license? I cannot remember right now. I'm sorry. And they just redid the licensing on Monday, to be honest. And I had the link to the new licensing in the first slide, the licensing slide. Please check and see.
It
Honestly,
wasn't previously. It was not previously, but I'm not sure after the redo with the licensing whether it's in there now or not.
Yeah, so sorry, Wesley. Don't know. And then support file will be available for download. So yes, we are going to share this presentation so you have easy access to the links and the information, because I know it's kind of a lot in a short amount of time. So with that, oops, wrong one. This is my contact information. So please feel free to reach out to me at any time with questions. That's how I get ideas about blog posts to write and just generally have an understanding of where people's minds are at and in the industry. So it's never a bother. Please reach out to me. And then thanks again to our sponsors that really made this conference happen and is allowing us to do this free learning.